fiscal policy, but long for monetary policy. Well, what we care about is how long are all of these lags, these policy lags. Because what that tells us then is that once a problem develops, how long is it before we have a policy response that has any effect on the overall economy? So what this suggests then is that while in our models it's very easy to shift our curves back and forth to figure out exactly what we should do, in the real world it's a bit more complicated than that. We have to actually build into our models these various time lags. Now, one of the things that this means then is whatever case there is for activism, amongst those Keynesian-type economists who think that wages and prices are relatively sticky, is now much weaker. Remember, the typical recession in the United States is 11 months long. If from the time the negative shock happens, data lag, recognition lag, okay, that's maybe, say, 5 months. Now we've got the implementation lag. Why do we use monetary policy as our primary stabilization tool? It can act quickly, right? That legislative and implementation lag are very, very short, so it can happen right away. Now what the problem we have is what's that effectiveness lag look like? What we don't want to have happen is the economy to have gone into a recession, the self-correcting mechanisms start to work, we've got the economy coming out of recession, and now have the stimulus policy kick in and push us way beyond potential output, giving us higher inflation. We don't want what we hope is a counter-cyclical policy, a policy that's put in to dampen the business cycle, to actually end up, because of these policy lags, amplifying the business cycle, making it pro-cyclical. I remember, long, long time ago, galaxy far, far away. So in 1963, actually I read about this in the ancient history books, not nearly old enough to have actually remembered this, but in the ancient history books it says that in 1963 the economy was going into a recession, and the Congress passed a massive, or the president asked for a fiscal stimulus. Actually, it was to speed up and finalize construction on the interstate highway system. And Congress had to debate it. They finally passed it 3 years later. But 3 years later was 1966. The war in Vietnam was heating up. The economy was already back at potential. And then we added all this additional stimulus to the economy to finish constructing the interstate highway system. So not only did we end up with having this policy become effective at the wrong time, it actually pushed the unemployment rate way down and gave us a rising inflation situation. Not good timing, right? So we need to think about that when we, these kinds of things when we think about stabilization policy. Now, I mentioned earlier that we have to think about what should a central bank do when faced with a negative short-run aggregate supply shock. We saw last time that with aggregate demand shocks, in long-run aggregate supply shocks, that a central bank can just target inflation. By targeting inflation, they're also targeting unemployment at the natural rate. But that doesn't work so well when we have negative short-run aggregate supply shocks. Targeting inflation gave us a bigger deviation in terms of economic output. Targeting output or unemployment gave us much bigger deviations in terms of inflation. So what do? Well, a rule that has been proposed called the Taylor rule. Yes, this is the same Taylor as the Taylor principle. He likes to put his name on things that he dreams up. So the Taylor rule is a way of dealing with that. And what the Taylor rule looks at is the output gap and the inflation gap. So rather than just doing inflation targeting, let's think about inflation targeting, but let's also have some weight associated with the output gap. So here's the equation for the Taylor rule. So the Taylor rule says that the real interest rate that the central bank sets should equal 2 plus 1/2 of the inflation gap plus 1/2 of the output gap. Now, remember that the real interest rate is simply the nominal rate minus expected inflation, or with sticky prices in the short run, actual inflation. Right? This is the Fisher equation. So if we substitute in here and simplify, what we see is that the nominal rate that the central bank controls, what we call the federal funds rate in the United States, equals the inflation rate plus 2 plus 1/2 of the inflation gap plus 1/2 of the output gap. Now, 2, you might wonder, where the heck does 2 come from? So the 2 comes from, well, mostly because it was between 1 and 3, but the reason it's in the equation as 2 is when you calculate the real short-term interest rate over a 30, 40, 50-year period, long enough period to assume that on average we were in equilibrium, it comes out to be 2. So it's basically the long-run historic average of the real Fed funds rate. So that was viewed then as kind of the neutral or equilibrium real interest rate. And then we're either going to add something to that or subtract something from that, depending upon where actual inflation is compared to its target and actual output is compared to potential. So notice that if output is above potential, this would say add 2 to get whatever the real interest rate would be. So if we're operating above potential, where we would expect inflation to accelerate, the Taylor rule says increase the real interest rate. Now notice that if inflation goes up above the target level, this is also positive, and that says raise the real interest rate by 1/2 of whatever that output gap, or excuse me, that inflation gap is. So again, if we've got too much inflation, we should raise the real interest rate. Now, when we look at this second equation, there's something else that we can see. Suppose inflation goes up by 1 percentage point. How much will we raise the nominal interest rate? Well, if we go up by 1 percentage point, there's 1. And if we look at the inflation gap, there's another 1/2. So the nominal rate would go up by 1.5 percentage points for every 1 percentage point increase in inflation. Remember the Taylor principle? We need to raise the nominal interest rate by more than the increase in the real interest rate to ensure that the increase in the inflation rate in order to make sure the real interest rate increases. So that Taylor principle is actually built into the Taylor rule. It's part of it. It's part of it. It's the part that runs along with changes in the inflation gap. What the output gap does is to tell us how we should shift the MP curve up and down, a discretionary or autonomous monetary policy based on what's happening to the output gap. So we've got, in this Taylor rule, both autonomous as well as endogenous monetary policy. So if we back up to this equation, suppose we had that negative short-run aggregate supply shock. Suppose, because of that, inflation went up by 1 percentage point, or the inflation gap goes up by 1 percentage point. This says, okay, we've got to make a change over here, right? We need to make a change. But now we also have output going down. Suppose the output gap goes down by 1 percentage point. So the inflation gap would say raise the nominal interest rate. The output gap would say lower the real interest rate. If the changes in the two gaps were the same, these last two would fall out, and we would go up by whatever the change in inflation was. So that negative short-run aggregate supply shock basically tells us raise the real interest rate anyway, just not nearly as much as you would in an inflation targeting situation. Okay? In other words, we're going to kind of split the difference here, taking into consideration both inflation and what's happening to economic output. So here's a chart that shows the actual Fed funds rate in blue and the Taylor rule in red. Now, one thing to keep in mind, Taylor published his article, or it was in a conference proceedings, in the early 1990s. So basically, we didn't have this rule written down. But if you look prior to when the Taylor rule was formalized, one of the things that you'll see is, gosh, that looks like how the central bank behaves anyway. Right? Most of the movements up and down are pretty close. The general trend, the short-term trend, yeah, there are gaps, but the central bank does seem to be following something that seems to be about the Taylor rule. Shouldn't be surprising. Remember, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate, price stability and maximum sustainable employment. That says we should be looking at both the unemployment rate, or the unemployment gap, the output gap, as well as the inflation gap. And of course, since the rule was formalized, the Federal Reserve still has a tendency to follow something along the lines of what the Taylor rule would suggest. Now, of course, there are deviations between the two, and this also leads to lots of discussions. Part of those discussions have to do with what the central bank should be doing, and that includes today. So in this period of time, the early 2000s to the mid-2000s, it was argued that the Federal Reserve kept the federal funds rate below where it should have been in quotation marks, right? Kept it below the Taylor rule suggestion. Some people have said this is why we had a housing boom. Interest rates were artificially too low because of monetary policy, which stimulated a lot more borrowing, which led to housing boom, buying, and construction. Not so sure. Okay, and then what we have over here is this other situation where we are today, where the nominal Fed funds rate has been stuck at zero since the end of 2008, and you can see that the Taylor rule at one point said we need to be negative, big negative output gap with no inflation, but now it says we should be up around 2 or 3%. So when you think about where the economy is today, right, economic output's growing, not very rapidly. We've been averaging 2.25%, 2.5% for the last 5 years. Not very strong growth, especially coming out of a very, very deep recession. And while the unemployment rate is down to 5.8%, other measures of the labor market are not all that wonderful. So if you look at the number of discouraged workers, if you look at the number of people working part-time who would like full-time work, if you look at the number of people, the hours of part-time workers, I'll turn this off for a minute. Than the unemployment rate itself. Other people listen to this. Okay. So should we have higher nominal interest rates? Are higher nominal interest rates going to make the economy grow faster or slower? Well, higher nominal interest rates, if inflation doesn't change, remember that also means higher real interest rates, make the economy grow faster or slower? Slower, right? Just think about your IS curve. If you increase the real interest rate, you're going to have a movement back along the IS curve. Economic output will be lower than it would be otherwise. Okay, now we have to also think about where inflation comes from, right? And why we sometimes have high rates of inflation. Back when we did the quantity theory of money, I used this quote from Milton Friedman, who said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Right? And in the context of the quantity theory of money, that makes sense. But how about in the short run? Is inflation always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon? One of the things that we've seen, saw last Thursday in fact, is a central bank can target inflation where they want it to be. So even in the short run, the central bank has a great deal of control over the level of inflation in an economy. They cannot, however, have any influence over potential output or the equilibrium real interest rates. Right? That all has to do with the classical dichotomy and the long-run neutrality of money. And what we saw last week with inflation targeting, it didn't really matter that we had sticky wages and prices. How much the central bank has to do might have an influence, but the central bank can still target inflation at essentially any level that it would like. So the question then becomes, why do we sometimes have high levels of inflation? And it boils down to the fact that price stability, or low and stable inflation rate, is not always the central bank's primary goal. Sometimes their primary goal is high levels of employment, or low levels of unemployment. And this can lead to two types of inflation that we need to look at. The first is known as cost-push inflation, which comes about because of a short-run aggregate supply shock while the central bank wants to maintain high levels of employment. The second is what we call a demand-pull inflation, which comes about because we're trying to keep the economy operating above potential output. So let's suppose for a moment that we're in general equilibrium and we're at our target inflation rate. We now have a negative short-run aggregate supply shock, but we want to keep the economy at a high level of employment. So here we are in general equilibrium. Our negative short-run aggregate supply shock would shift the short-run aggregate supply curve up, leading immediately to a lower level of economic output and a higher level of inflation. But if the government is actually committed to a high level of employment, they need to get the economy back to potential. So they can do that with an expansionary monetary policy. So with that expansionary monetary policy, the aggregate demand curve will shift out, the economy will go back to potential output, but guess what? The consequences of maintaining a high level of employment is a high level of inflation. So how can we get to high levels of inflation? If we focus on keeping the economy at potential or the unemployment rate at the natural rate, then when the economy is hit by a negative short-run aggregate supply shock, boom, you're going to end up with higher inflation. So we get back to the economy at potential, the unemployment rate at the natural rate, the real interest rate at its equilibrium level, but inflation is now permanently higher. Okay, so that's cost-push inflation. Now let's think about demand-pull inflation. In this case, we'll start in general equilibrium at our target inflation rate. Again, we want to increase employment even more. So in this case, we start at potential, but we have a positive aggregate demand shock. Again, what we can see is that economic output will immediately rise, so employment will also go up, but inflation will rise as well. Now, if in the following year we get our short-run aggregate supply adjustment, but if the government still wants that higher level of employment, they have to increase aggregate demand again, another expansionary monetary policy, so they can keep economic output above potential, in this example for 2 years in a row, and what do they end up with? Even more inflation. And we know that eventually when they abandon this policy, the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift up even more. The economy will end up back at potential, but inflation is going to be a lot higher. So again, in the long run, we end up with the economy back at potential, the unemployment rate at the natural rate, so we can only keep it below for a certain length of time. The equilibrium real interest rate stays the same, and inflation is permanently higher. So what both of these examples show is that focusing on economic output, the output gap, or the unemployment rate, the unemployment gap, and not focusing on inflation can lead to permanently higher inflation. Okay? And here's how we can see this, or recognize the kind of situation that we're in. So in this chart, what we see is that the unemployment rate is below the natural rate in the 1960s and early 70s, which means that the economy is operating above potential. When we operate above potential for a long period of time, we have demand-pull inflation. And there you can see it. But after that, notice that we got a sharp increase in the unemployment rate here and here. We went above the natural rate. So if we have inflation during these big increases in the unemployment rate, we should also have seen, if we have inflation when we see the unemployment rate rising, we should have cost-push inflation. So notice what we got. Boom, boom, during those 2 periods of time. Okay. And if you know anything about what happened here, these are oil price shocks in both cases. Okay, now let's shift topics a little bit and talk about monetary policy at the zero lower bound. Remember that nominal interest rates don't go negative. Since the central bank only controls nominal interest rates, short-term nominal interest rates, they can only push them down to zero. Once we get there, we're at what is known as the zero lower bound. That means from that point on, both the MP curve and the aggregate demand curve are different. So when we think about that, we can look at the monetary policy curve. So here's our real interest rate, here's our inflation rate. Now we know that most of the time the monetary policy curve is upward sloping. But let's suppose that an inflation rate of 2%, the central bank is now at the zero lower bound. So if we remember that the real interest rate equals the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate, Fisher equation, yes, it's supposed to be the expected inflation rate, but let's just assume that inflation is very steady. So if the nominal interest rate is equal to 0, notice the real interest rate is a negative of the inflation rate. So if this point is our zero lower bound, that means that this real interest rate must be minus 2%. Now, what happens when inflation falls to 1%? When inflation falls to 1%, the real interest rate has to be minus 1%. Or up here. So when the inflation rate falls, the real interest rate rises. So we now have a segment of the monetary policy curve, once the zero lower bound is in place, that's upward sloping, backwards upward sloping. And if the inflation rate goes